makes me look like when I started diving here in 1998, because as far as the eye could see, there were crayfish crawling all over the bottom, and you know, that's long gone, but we can definitely bring it back.
We've got to bring it back. That was just, and we see the little, not just big abalones, the little abalones attached to the attached to the leaves of the. We've got a close up on one of them.
Abs, is that
Little spat, yeah. I've just swum with this amazing scientist, Scott Link from IMAS, and Mick Barron, Eaglehawk Dive Centre crew. This transect along here, nearly 1,500 baby macrocystis giant kelp that are slowly regrowing. This whole area was so thick with kelp we couldn't even get a boat here in the old days, and they've all vanished because of climate change. But because of an amazing bunch of people who are dedicated to the ocean, they're trying to bring these ecosystems back by restoring them, and it gives me a lot of hope to see it here today. We've got to do a lot more of this, hell of a lot more of this, but this is really encouraging. Gives me some optimism. Hard day in the office. I recently stumbled onto this quote from Charles Darwin on the importance of giant kelp, and it got me thinking. I can only compare these great aquatic forests with the terrestrial ones in the intertropical region. Yet, if in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of the kelp. Amidst the leaves of this plant, numerous species of fish live, which nowhere else could find food or shelter. I couldn't help wondering if this was prophetic or a warning. In recent years, Tasmania experienced a marine heatwave, believed to be one of the largest in recorded history. More than 95% of our giant kelp forests, so loved by Charles Darwin, have now vanished. Our Great Southern Reef System is also under severe threat from invasive urchins, also linked to warming oceans. Our oceans are warming due to climate change, directly linked to the burning of fossil fuels. While many Australians are aware the World Heritage listed Great Barrier Reef, are they also aware of the changes we are seeing in Tasmania's troubled waters? Even though I've been raising attention to this in our federal parliament now for years, even screaming in tears of rage and frustration, I'm a politician, and people are understandably cynical of politics fixing this problem. So I took a different approach. I decided to go and talk to experts and those who have witnessed the changes, then take these authentic voices out to our communities and get the conversation going on how we can all do our bit to tackle this greatest challenge of our time. First port of call was to go down to Eaglehawk Neck on the southeast coast of Tassie and speak with Mick Barron, the owner of a dive shop down there. Mick first appeared at my Senate inquiry in 2016 into warming oceans, and I was keen to hear what he had to say. So Mick, You're in every meaning of the word a saltwater person. Now, why is the ocean important to you, mate? Like, tell us a bit about your journey.
Yeah, well, I guess growing up right next to the water in a little town on the northwest coast of Tassie, the first thing I'd do every morning when I woke up was look out and see what the state of the ocean was. It was good enough to go in diving, swimming, I was out there.
Yeah. You know, you've got this working in fisheries and spending so much of your life under the water and observing the ocean. What changes have you seen, over your lifetime? I'm especially here in Eaglehawk because you know the area so well. What have you observed?
The jack mackerel.
Yeah.
Up until sort of mid-late 90s, around about the April time when the temperatures would drop under 15, you'd have these massive schools of jack mackerel. We haven't seen any mackerel of that ilk for over 10 years.
Yeah.
And of course, the most obvious one is the kelp forest disappearance. Yeah.
I heard. I've spoken to some old fishermen further up the coast who said there are places like north of Diamond Island and Bicheno up to Seymour where it was so thick you struggle to take a boat in there sometimes.
Yep.
Is that true? Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All up the coast, any semi-shelters to semi-exposed areas, there was the big kelp. It was a pain in the butt because it was foul up your propellers and it was everywhere.
Yeah.
But the change has been in the last 20 years now. Time gets on. We've seen it here. It moved. It disappeared further north, and it just slowly disappeared. It moved down the coast.
So what's going on, Mick? What's your view on why we've seen these changes in the ocean here?
Well, the changes are without any question. There is no doubt at all what's happening. The temperatures of the water, especially in winter, the temperatures. We'll put it this way. Scientifically known that the water of Eden is now here in a period of 40 years. The three-dimensional aspect of it gives you a real sense of space and flying, when you're in it. Yeah.
So talk us through that. Like, what was it for the many people who probably never get to dive on a giant kelp forest? Tell us what it was like.
Well, you see movies of Avatar flying through the trees and all that sort of stuff. It's like that. If you imagine flying over a tropical rainforest, you're looking down through the trees. When you're high up and you can look down 20 metres and sometimes higher over the top of these massive great trees, and looking at you flying along underneath, and you're looking up and you've got the sun dappling through the canopy and the surface. It's an experience that obviously 99.9% of the people in the world never see, but it is a unique experience. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
So the disappearance of the forests, of course, in our little business we're lucky enough, as I said before, we have diversity. We have dragons, we have seals, some people don't like seals, but they are a major attraction. We have beautiful sponges in the deep and all that, caves, of course, all that. But the kelp forest in itself was, with one or two other habitats, the main attraction that we had here.
Does it give you any optimism that there may be a way we can engineer our way out of this and use science and get a lot of money behind farming kelp and new species? Is it something you think you might see in your lifetime?
Well, what am I now? I just turned 66 the other day, and it's been 40 years on the downward side. Things will have to move pretty quickly. I'd like to see some more effort put into looking after the local environment, without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. But to actually regrow kelp forests, it's a massive undertaking. It's questionable, but you don't know until you try. Yeah.
With a lot of information out there, a lot of misinformation, fake news, it's really important that we listen to the science. We talk to the people that have spent their life studying these challenges, talking about how real it is and how we fix it. Craig, how long have you been researching reefs? What's your journey Tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are today.
I started researching reefs as part of my PhD in Canada. That's about a bit over 35 years ago. I moved back to Tasmania at the end of the 1990s, and by 2000 was deeply involved in looking at what was happening on the east coast with sea urchins and with kelps.
Now, I understand Charles Darwin had a bit of a love affair with giant kelp off the coast of South America when he was on the voyage of the Beagle. You used that in your PhD. You quoted that at the beginning of your PhD.
So he was when he was on the Beagle and sailing through Magellan Strait, Tierra del Fuego there, he just noticed the fantastic biodiversity that was associated with these giant kelp beds, and he made a comment that the number of organisms of all orders that is associated with the kelp is wonderful, was his comment. And he really did straight away recognise the importance of those kelp beds as critical habitat for a very large array of other species and organisms.
And what have you seen? What kind of noticeable changes have you seen in the reefs and the ecosystems off the east coast of Tasmania over that time period?
When I came back to Tasmania, I noticed two things straight away. One is that these big, dense surface canopies of giant kelp, which were so prevalent in Tasmania when I was much younger, a lot of them had gone. And then as soon as I got underwater, I started noticing the extent of urchin populations of this new species that arrived from New South Wales, and the fact that it was forming these extensive barren grounds in some places. In other words, wiping out all the kelp, and it's just bare rock and urchins that are remaining, because that was a new experience for Tasmania. So I certainly blew the whistle and raised the red flag there to say that this was something that we needed to pay attention to.
So these urchins, how did they kind of come down to Tasmanian waters? Was it linked with anything in particular, or were they indigenous to the water in any way, or?
So the problem urchin has come down from New South Wales. It's a range extension southward, and that reflects a very distinct change in the behaviour of the East Australian current. So the East Australian current has a separation point about halfway down New South Wales where it shoots back across the top of New Zealand, but at that point it spins eddies off, and those eddies of East Australian current water propagate southward and influence the east coast of Tasmania. Now those eddies used to be relatively rare. Now the east coast water is dominated by those eddies. So bigger eddies coming off more frequently, moving south. So when they do, they bring very warm, nutrient-poor water, and of course in that water are all of the organisms from that part of New South Wales that come through. So that's how the urchins arrived, and with the amount of warming that we've had, that warming that is maintained in eastern Tasmania now, the environment is suitable for the urchin to establish here. So most of the larvae now come from the Tasmanian populations, which are fully reproductive, and it's here to stay basically.
So obviously we know this was a very extensive reef system and habitat. Well, why is kelp important habitat for biodiversity? What is it about giant kelp or any kelp, for example, that is important?
So a few reasons. First of all, it creates physical habitat. So as you know, anytime you put anything in the water, you'll attract various animals, and it's a substrate for other things to grow on as well. So an artificial reef, a jetty, anytime you put a structure in the water, you attract other organisms. So that really complex, diverse physical habitat that those effectively big algae provide, it's like trees in a forest, they just provide habitat for a lot of other species. But the other reason is their productivity. So kelp beds are amongst the most productive habitats on Earth. Their productivity is absolutely phenomenal. The kind of rates of production are similar, in fact often exceed the best production that you would ever get out of an intensely managed agricultural system. So if you imagine an agricultural system with perfect soil, loads of nutrient, fertiliser, water and everything, the kind of productivity you'd get out of that, an alfalfa field for example, kelp beds often exceed that in nature. So the combined effect of all of that production and that wonderful physically heterogeneous habitat just makes life grand for all of those other organisms to be there.
We learnt in the Senate this week in estimates from the Bureau of Meteorology that the current business as usual scenario will put us on track to a 3 to 4 degree warming by the end of this century. That was from the Bureau of Meteorology. Do you feel that with that kind of warming, even with the adaptation measures we've talked about today, we'll be able to restore the marine system?
I don't want to think about 3 or 4 degree warming. I'm not a climate scientist, Peter. I have read all of the literature, or a lot of the literature around what this world might look like if we go to that level of warming. I don't really want to contemplate it. We know that we'll be right over a bunch of key thresholds with that level of warming that will kick in positive feedbacks that will just accelerate it if we get to those sort of warming levels. So what we need to be doing as a community, as a contributor to global society, is making sure that we do our bit to keep warming at that less than that 1.5 degree threshold. That's got to be the target. If we're talking 3 or 4 degrees, then there'll be parts of this planet that are no longer inhabitable, basically. And that we will see massive changes terrestrially and in the marine systems as well with that level of warming.
So after chatting with Craig, it's really hit home how serious this issue is. You can feel his sense of frustration and concern with the changes that he's seen over his lifetime as a scientist. He's obviously got a deep connection to the ocean and loves the ocean. And there's some hope there too. Clearly we need to remove as many urchins as possible from the ocean, the Centrostephanus. It's great the work that's being done by the fishing industry, actually catching these urchins and making a living from them, selling them commercially. It's good that you can eat some of them. But it's not, listening to Craig and other scientists, it's not a silver bullet. We need to go into deeper waters, and I'd be really keen to see the federal government put some serious funding into looking at autonomous underwater vehicles that can actually catch and kill urchins in deeper waters, because that's a big part of the problem. So yeah, it's great that we're seeing ingenuity and even an industry being created out of solving a problem, but we've just got to be aware, and politically speaking, we've got to be aware that it's not going to fully solve the problem. We've got to do a lot more.
Unless something's done about Centrostephanus urchin barrens, we can be pretty sure that a lot of the reef, well over 50% in my view, would be lost to urchin barrens. So we're just talking about bare reef. A lot of the endemic species here in Tasmania will disappear because they won't be able to survive or compete with the species that are better adapted, that are going to be coming down on the mainland, from the mainland on the East Australian current. So I think it'll be a very different place. It won't look like the Tasmanian marine environment that we're used to. It probably won't be as productive. We probably won't have the amazing abalone and rock lobster fisheries that we have at the moment. Already we're seeing summer heat waves having a huge impact on abalone. Abalone simply die when they get too warm. Rock lobsters may well be replaced by another species of rock lobster, and that may well change the reef ecosystems and the productivity of fisheries. So it's a scary thing to contemplate. I think it's horrifying that we aren't doing more to try and stop this from occurring.
You can't have a documentary or a film on the changes to our oceans that we're seeing here in Tassie without speaking to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. There's been few communities that have been as affected as them. They have this 60,000 year long connection to the sea. They've lived and survived. They're saltwater people. So I'm really looking forward to going and chatting, finding out more from Dean and Auntie Lola, hooking up with them and asking them about the kind of changes they've seen in their lifetime, as well as the law that's passed down through various generations that they're directly connected with. Well, thank you, Auntie Lola, and thank you, Dean, for talking to us today. Could we start by exploring what the ocean meant to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and why it's culturally significant?
For me, I'm an Aboriginal elder who was born and grew up on Cape Barren Island as a child, and then later on moved to live on Flinders Island before I came to live in Launceston in '72. But I would suggest that, big part of our culture is that we could call ourselves saltwater people. I first learned to collect the mariner shells to make the necklace, which was, I didn't realise so much at the time that how important, what cultural value that had on our life. The mariner shells are really such a strong, significant cultural practice that has gone on. But the kelp, the bull kelp itself, where the women made the water carriers and carried their fresh water in that, and they hung on the end of their shelters. And when you think about that, well, that was also part of their well-being, because storing water in kelp is very good for, preventing goiter. So, there's a huge significance of, and of course the women dived for the abalone. So there's some beautiful sketches of that in the historical records.
Well, what apart from abalone, what other food was commonly sourced from the ocean by?
Well, you see the kelp, and you can eat the kelp as well, because we've eaten that in our workshop even recently, which is quite nice. If you cut the stalks of the kelp and slice them, and we put them on a barbecue and had them that way as a as a nibbly, I suppose, with the rest of the food. And don't collect any more than what you should, and make sure you're very strict about how you clean your shells. But the final thing was only collect what you need for now and leave the rest for somebody else to come along and be able to get, because we're not then cleaning areas out.
Look, we're all actually very, very sad and quite shocked at the pace of change. Like, I don't think any of us predicted things were changing this quickly. Did you ever think you would see these kind of changes in your lifetime, having come from a proud culture and history of tens of thousands of years, living off the coast and living off the sea, such enormous changes in such a short period of time?
I've always predicted that, and this is probably about 5 years ago, I said, look, there may not be any of our women being able to do the same cultural practices as what the opportunities that I've had. Look, within 10 years our opportunities could be gone, because when you think that the necklaces really are strictly related to the seaweed and the kelp that they grow on, and it seems to be more fragile and
it's not the same. No, it's not.
It's not good quality.
No, it's very poor quality now. You've already spoken to Dr. Kane. I think he would verify that there's obviously some structural changes.
Like ocean acidification potentially?
Oh, for sure. And I was speaking to, I think, the head of the CSIRO in Hobart, who wants to do a project on the ocean acidification, especially around the Flinders Island and Cape Barren area. They've got records that go back for a long way in these areas because of the various stations they've got around observing these facts. Think about deep time on this. So the Aboriginal people of Tasmania have faced climate change before, when in fact Tasmania was formed. So we're talking, I think, two different anthropocenic effects. We have what I would call an indigenous non-anthropocene effect, where we lived and sustainably supported the land in a life world's perspective. But then you've got the colonist, or the other effect, which
white fella effect.
White fella effect, which
is pretty
is
accurate.
Which is creating all these other changes. Yes, we've adapted, and we're a more contemporary Aboriginal culture now, but it's all these things you have to take, and all these layerings you've got to apply.
But I believe that the environment talks to us as well. I'll give you a couple of different examples. On the east coast, we could go down there after there's been a big storm, and what happens in that big storm? It comes up and it'll throw 2 foot of sand over the top of the shells, and we haven't been able to collect anything.
The kelp, when it breaks down on the seashore, normally hardens up dries up, and then you've got where I noted this time it was rotting and full of maggots.
Yeah.
It's broken down to this whole gooby thing. So there's obviously massive changes in the structure of the kelp.
Yeah. I think what's really struck me about having chat to Dean and Auntie Lola is just how much these changes that we're all seeing in our oceans are actually part of their loss. They're working to try and regain their cultural identity. They're looking to work directly with kelp and with seaweed, and in their art and in their dances and in their communications, and yet they're suffering. Not only have they suffered for hundreds of years under us whitefellas, but they're now seeing the environment changing. So this is where it kind of gets quite difficult for me, because unless we address the underlying causes of all these problems, which is warming oceans from rising emissions, we're probably never going to win. So we've always got to keep in mind that we've got to try and take climate action. And as David Attenborough recently said, we can't be radical enough in the action we take, given what's at stake. But we've also got to have a mindset that these massive challenges we face are massive opportunities. And here in Tasmania, for example, there's enormous opportunities in, for example, growing seaweed commercially, growing seaweed for carbon offsets, growing seaweed to restore ecosystems, growing seaweed for a whole range of different commercial applications, from replacing plastic products through to food, through to additives in cosmetics, a whole range of different things. Like, seaweed could be the next big industry for Tasmania.
I'm Associate Professor Katrina McLeod. I work at IMAS, and I'm Centre Head of the Ecology and Biodiversity Centre, IMAS being the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. The Marine Bioproducts CRC is an initiative that involves scientists from all around Australia and industry partners, and there's government involvement, and it's actually looking at developing the potential for the marine bioproducts industry in Australia. Yeah. There's significant potential in that area. Huge at the moment. The market for marine bioproducts is largely dominated by corporations out of Southeast Asia, China, Japan. The potential is massive for Australia in that space, given our clean coastal systems, and the CRC is looking at a range of areas, both what species to produce, what you do with it, where is the market and the product, and how we get it from the species we grow through to that end product. Marine bioproducts have huge potential applications. Sushi, when we have the nori around sushi, so food-based products that we're quite familiar with, to some fairly interesting new food-based products, and the potential to seaweed has very high protein, some of them, so there's real potential to evolve into new products that people might not be familiar with. We have them in cattle feed, people are probably aware of animal feeds. The fertilizers are often associated with seaweed products, but there's a lot more in the sort of nutraceutical and pharmaceutical space, even up to some really high-tech, high-end bioproducts around medical dyes for medical imaging. It's a natural-based dye that you can use in these spaces, and those are the sort of innovative products that have potential.
We have no choice at this point in history but to protect more of our oceans, and there's a big global push to do this. A really exciting initiative that's now getting global traction, and actually the Australian government has signed on for this, is to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030. So I think it's really important to point out that that protection's got to be genuine, okay? It's got to have integrity. It's not just about putting areas on maps. You've actually got to put in place real protections. The problem with our federal marine protection system is it looks good on maps, but when you get down to the fine detail, a lot of the areas have had their protections cut. You can still go and drill for oil and gas in them, you can still fish in them, you can still take tourist operators in them. And Tasmania It's got some of the lowest areas of marine protected areas of any state in this country. And that's totally unacceptable, because we know the areas we have protected have been really useful in helping us better understand the challenges we face. Maria Island Marine Reserve, for example, was where we discovered that giant rock lobsters were the only thing that were helping control invasive urchin barrens. Close your eyes and imagine what you want the ocean to look like in 50 years' time. And remember, the choice is yours. Do you want future generations, your children, to see what you have seen? An ocean teeming with life, full of biodiversity and abundance? Or do you want it to be an ocean that is just a shadow of its former self? And then remember, it's down to you. It's on all of us. If we take climate action, listen to scientists, listen to elders, listen to fishers and those who care for the sea, if we let our politicians know we will vote for the change we want to see in the world, we can change the course of history. Believe that.
Authorised by Peter Whish-Wilson, Australian Greens, Parliament House, Canberra.